What's up, everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name's Eric and I'm a professional photographer based out of San Francisco, California. And in my last video I created this cheap DIY copy stand using a cutting board and a few different fittings you can find at your local hardware store to just create this really affordable copy stand that anyone can make at a really low price. So today I wanted to create a video that goes over my entire digital scanning process from start to finish using this scan that I created, and essentially just give you some tips and things you need in order to get successful scans at home. The first thing that you're going to need to get are these right here. These are called these are called essentially negative scan carriers. And what these do is they make sure that it keeps your film flat and stable so you're able to capture the negative fairly well. A lot of these are built very well. My favorite brand across the board is Negative Supply. They make really great products. A little expensive, but for the most part it's worth every penny. This one right here is their basic 35mm film carrier, coming in at around $100 US. This right here will speed up your scanning time and just keep your film entirely flat. The 120 carrier is listed at just at $200 US. This one right here, not really my favorite, but it does a really great job of keeping your negative incredibly flat. The next thing that you're going to need to get is one of these, which is a light table. You're going to be tempted to use an iPad or an iPhone or an Android. You don't want to do that because those have pixels in it, and that is going to negatively impact your final image. So just get yourself a good light table. These are fairly affordable. You can find a good one on Amazon for around $20 to $40. Just make sure that you're reading the reviews to ensure you're getting a good one. The one I use is the Kaiser Slim Light Plano, which is really nice. It has a chargeable battery so I can turn it on and off without it being connected. I usually always have it connected because when it's connected it creates a bit of a brighter light, which is always good. That means that my shutter speed is going to be a lot higher, so I don't have any jitters or whatever. But this one is a little expensive at around, I think, 120 bucks. You don't need to spend that much, but I do strongly encourage you to find a good one, and you can do that by just reading the reviews. The next thing is one of these. This is just called a dust blower. This right here is effective for just removing any dust particles off of the top of the film. With DSLR or digital scanning, you don't really get that much dust unless it's like a piece of lint or a piece of hair. I don't really see that much dust in this method versus using like the Epson V500 or V600, which tentatively catches every dust particle. Not really the case, but you always want to make sure that you just kind of clean it off so it just reduces your editing and having to remove dust off the film. Next is going to be some cotton gloves. You don't need these technically. If you're well versed with film, you probably already know to hold film from the sides, but if you're an individual that likes to touch the film or likes to just kind of put your fingers on the film, getting cotton gloves is going to prevent you from getting smudges or fingerprints on the film, which you obviously do not want. But for the most part, you can get away with not having those because you can always just kind of work with touching the film on the edges. But if your film is very curly, it's always good to have a pair of cotton gloves just to make sure that you can work with it. Next, you're going to need a shutter release cable. So the shutter release cable that I have is for the Canon 6D, which is the camera I'm going to be going over next in the camera settings, but you are going to need to get yourself a shutter release cable. With DSLR or digital scanning, you are going to have longer shutter speeds or longer shutter times, so you want to make sure you're not touching the camera to get any micro jitters. That's going to negatively impact the final image. So make sure you just get yourself a good shutter release cable. These are fairly cheap, and there are a lot of off-market brands that create these that work very, very good. And then lastly, as a camera, you are going to need a digital camera for this. You can use an older model, a mirrorless camera, it doesn't really matter. As long as it can take images and you can control some of the settings, you should be fairly good to go. I'm using the Canon 6D Mark II, which is a full-frame DSLR. And when it comes to lenses, you want to make sure that you're using prime lenses. I'm using a 100mm lens because it is that 1:1 ratio with 35mm film, and I'm able to utilize the entire sensor, which is really important when it comes to digital scanning because you want to make sure that you're utilizing the entire camera's potential and not just a small portion of it. You're going to be tempted to use the prime lenses that come in the box for your camera. Those are not going to work. It's always recommended that you use the prime lenses. 100 millimeters is really good for 35 millimeter film, and for 120 film, 85 millimeters is pretty good because you can get fairly close to the image, and you'll be able to fully utilize the entire sensor, which is what you want. So lastly, you are going to need to get a negative conversion software just to speed up the process. You could take videos, you could, take classes on how to do that manually, but it's not really recommended. It takes a lot of time and knowledge, and it's just always better just to have the software just to make your life a lot easier and to make your work fairly consistent. I happen to use Negative Lab Pro. It's one of my favorite softwares. It simulates some of the highest end scanners on the market that are essentially out of budget for a lot of people, like the Frontier scanner, which is valued at around 6 to 7, and the Noritsu scanner, which is just about the same. Both of these simulations really make the film look really nice, and it just gives you that really nice lab scans that you get when you drop it off at your local lab, which I really enjoy. That software comes in at around $100 US. You get 2 licenses. You can get one for your desktop, one for your laptop. It's really worth it. You can do a lot of really cool micro tweaks in there as well. Maybe adjust the temperature, add contrast, remove exposure. It's really great for just making those tweaks to remember how you shot that picture. It's okay to edit your film. I do that all the time. I typically will edit my film to remember how I shot that picture or how I remember seeing it. And it's usually just some little micro tweaks here, maybe adjusting the temperature, removing some magenta, adding some blue, just stuff like that that is gonna just be really helpful in your final product. Now that we've talked about the things that you need, let's go over the camera settings to get successful scans. This is where it gets really tricky because every camera on the market is incredibly unique. Some cameras are really great with handling low light, other cameras are really bad with handling low light, and also your lens can be very different. It could be a brand, off market. All these are going to really contribute to your overall settings, so you're going to have to do some experimenting in this particular case. For example, the first thing we want to go over is ISO. ISO is always going to be set at the lowest that your camera can go, which is typically 100. That's typically the standard. I'm not sure if it's changed with mirrorless cameras, but usually 100 ISO is going to be the lowest that you can go. And you really want to make sure you're shooting at a low ISO so you don't introduce any noise or grain into the film, since that already has it. So you don't want to add any of that. The next thing is going to be your f-stop. Typically with f-stop, you're going to be at f8 or f11. This is going to ensure that you're shooting at the sharpest your lens can produce images and that everything is going to be in focus. You don't want to be shooting at a low ISO because that is going to introduce bokeh into your image, which is going to have areas that are in focus and areas that are fuzzy or blurry, and you don't want that in your final negative exposure. You want it to be perfect. So using f8 or f11 or whatever is your sharpest on the camera, that's going to give you the best scans. And last is going to be shutter speed. Shutter speed is going to be the trickiest overall because every camera is going to be very different. For example, right now my camera is setting at ISO 100 f8 and my shutter speed is at 2 seconds, which is a really long time. And that's going to be expected. This is an older camera. It's not a mirrorless camera that can really handle low light. So unfortunately, the shutter speed is going to be very, very low at just 2 seconds, which is an eternity in the terms of photography. So you are going to have to experiment with that. Perhaps maybe yours will be 1 second, maybe it will be 1/25th of a second. It's just really all going to depend on how your camera is going to be set up or how your camera is going to be working in these low light situations. You can also adjust the, if your light table allows, always make sure that you shoot at the, your light table should be at the highest setting or the brightest if possible. So that can actually help essentially reduce the shutter speed so you don't get any micro jitters. But that, of course, is where the shutter release cable comes in. The last is going to be the format. Typically, if you're going to be using a software conversion or if you're going to be converting in Lightroom manually, you're going to want to make sure that you shoot your image in RAW so it captures all the data possible so you can make those manipulations easily and not regretfully shoot that in a JPEG format because you're going to be stuck with limited controls, versus if you shoot in RAW, you get all the information from that image and you can tweak whatever you want. Plus, a lot of the software conversions have to be shot in RAW, and that of course is going to allow the software to work more effectively and create really good conversions. JPEG, the picture's already been compact down. When you put that in these specific types of softwares, you're gonna end up getting really strange images, sometimes a little too bright, too dark. So that's something to keep in mind when you are shooting. So I went ahead and gone over the settings and different things you may want to go over. Now let's go over what it looks like in camera and essentially what your image should look like in. So this is what it's gonna look like once you have your negative and the negative carrier and the light table. You'll be able to see that the entire sensor is being used here, and essentially this is gonna be a perfect scan. I'm leaving a little bit of the edges here because I am going to need that when I'm essentially converting this in Negative Lab Pro. I'm also going to be shooting in RAW, which is highly recommended. A lot of programs will not work just shooting it in standard JPEG, so make sure you're always shooting in RAW depending on whatever program you're using. But we're using Negative Lab Pro, and that essentially is going to be a requirement to shoot it in RAW. But you can see here that everything is in frame. There are multiple ways to focus on this specific negative. The first one you can do is just allowing the camera to do that, just utilizing different settings. I usually just don't do that, but what I typically do is I usually will zoom into the film, and then what I'll do is I'll manually focus in on the grain of the actual film itself, and that way I get very clean images. This is something that's very commonly done inside of dark rooms. You always focus in on the grain of the film, and that always is going to produce very good images. If you're using a mirrorless camera, there are so many different innovative things now that have been included to make sure things are in focus. So that can also be used. But at this point, it's going to be all experimental. You're just going to take some exposures. This right here looks like a pretty good image. You can see that there's really good detail that's showing here. However, if your image looks like this or like this, that's way too much. And if it looks like this, that's way too dark. So just experiment with the overall shutter speeds until you get one that is fairly good. That right there was the f-stop, but I just wanted to give you an example of what would be considered good. This would be too bright. This would be way too dark. So you want to make sure that you're at a good ratio. And the only way you'll really be able to do this is just by experimenting with the camera and just additional camera settings. Of course, I would keep your camera at ISO 100 and the f-stop between f8 or f11, and just mess around with the shutter speeds. You can also mess around with the different options your camera has to focus in, and that can also really help a lot with your overall negatives. So now that we've gone over that, let's go over what it looks like in the computer after we photograph some of these images here. But I'm going to be going over a black and white and a color image to show you the pretty cool dynamics of Negative Lab Pro and the things you can do with it. So right here is an image that I took when I was on a road trip here in California, and we're going to work with a black and white image first. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to color balance with Negative Lab Pro. You always have to make sure that you shoot in RAW, and then of course select one of the outskirts of like the empty frame part, and that's going to essentially color balance or essentially get the white balance correct. And then what we're going to do next is we're going to go ahead and essentially take out the borders, because the borders will negatively impact the way the film is scanned. I'm going to zoom in a little bit just so it works a lot better. And once you essentially do this, we're going to click Control N. It's a plugin to Lightroom, which is incredible. And we're just going to ignore all the other scanners and just do black and white for now. I'll go over the other scanners in the color section, but let's go ahead and convert this image. And I'm going to just close out this window very quickly just because we're going to essentially make some tweaks to this image. But right now we're going to go ahead and expand this back out again just to the edges here, so we get that right to the frame, and then bam. And this is pretty much what you get. So we're going to go ahead and do Control N again, and now we can start messing around with some stuff here. If you want to add some exposure, which I might just add a little bit, maybe even reduce some, a little darker. You can increase the contrast if you'd like to make it like simulate if you're pushing your film. And the temperatures aren't going to matter because this is a black and white image, but you can see like how nice of a quality this already is. If I zoom in, the quality in this is just, it's absolutely insane. I mean, I can zoom in fairly close and see like some of the words that are literally in the sign, which is just really great. I think this is a pretty good scan. And if I were to take this to a digital lab to get this printed, it's going to be able to get a pretty decent sized print and not lose any quality, which is really, really great. So this is what it looks like for black and white. Black and white's really basic. Color's a little more dynamic. So let's open up a color one and I'll show you what I mean by that. A color image in here. I already color corrected or white balanced it. You always just have to click on the border where there's no image, and that essentially will white balance your image. But with color, this is where the magic happens. You've also may notice that this one has like these edges on the side. That's because this is 120 film, and usually 100 millimeters isn't ideal because you get all these spaces on the bottom and on the top. That's why I think 85 millimeters is better, but for the most part, we'll make do with this image. So what we're gonna do first, it's the same thing we did with black and white. We're gonna go ahead and just kind of zoom in to the actual image itself, like so. And this is where the magic happens with Negative Lab Pro. This is where those cool simulations come into play with different scanners that they have programmed in here. They have the Noritsu simulator and the Frontier simulator. Noritsu is like that really awesome scanner that produces really nice, like that warm glow, kind of works really well with skin tones. Frontier looks a little more sharp, a little more digital, really good for like landscapes and whatnot. Noritsu's good for, you know, warm scenarios. I usually always use Noritsu, it's my favorite. So we're gonna go ahead and just click the convert. And just like that, it will convert your image. But what we're gonna do first is we're gonna close this out and just kind of go all the way to the edges here, and I could show you all the awesome things this program can do as far as tweaking your images to kind of remember what they look like when you shot it. So let's go ahead and bring up the screen again with Control N, and you have this here. There are a lot of different things you can do with your film on this. They have a whole bunch of different tones from just the standard lab. You can also make this in log, rich, and flat just to give it like that cinematic look, or if you want it to look flat or just kind of matte for more additional editing, you could do that. I typically just keep it on standard, and the main things I always work with is white balance, mids, highs, and shadows. I believe this is Kodak, so I usually will click Kodak, but you can see this looks a little too warm, so I might just put this back on none and just kind of work manually. So you have a lot of different things. You can control the mid, the highs, the shadows, all these really awesome things that you can do. You can add lab glow if you want to make it a little more matte. So it gives you a lot of different options, which is why it's one of my favorites. It makes tweaks very easy. Like for example, if I want to add a little bit more of the a little bit more yellow in here, I could maybe even increase a little bit of that magenta, and you can see that the image starts to look more lifelike. It almost kind of looks like this is how I remember this shot, but I would probably spend a little bit more time doing some more tweaks. I'm seeing a little bit of this redness in here that I don't like, but you could see just how powerful this program is. What's also great about what's really great about Negative Lab Pro as well is that you can use it for scans that you do with your Epson V550 or flatbed scanner. They have the instructions on how to do that as well. So I hope you enjoyed this video on how I get working images and how I convert my negatives and my overall process. It's pretty straight line. It's pretty easy. I mean, majority of it just use the program and just do these little micro tweaks to just kind of remember the image, how I shot it. And that pretty much ends the overall process. If you have any questions at all on this if you have any questions at all or want clarifications, please feel free to leave me a comment below if you found this video useful. Also, make sure to subscribe and like this video and share it with somebody that is, you know, wanting to get into digital scanning. And this is pretty much the workflow itself. So thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. I appreciate it, and we will see you on the next episode. So take it easy. Adios.